So let's take a look at the answers to the pictures and vocabulary matching for landforms. What I need you to do first is to make a chart in your notebook that looks like the slide on the next page. And as you listen to this presentation and you listen to the explanations, you write the correct answer for each slide in the chart. And there will be some additional notes given, things that will help you remember something about that landform and what distinguishes it from something else that's really similar. And that's going to help you on the assessment, which is coming up later this week. So make your chart in your notebook like this. You'll probably want to pause the video and copy this down, get some rulers, whatever you need to make it neat so that you can read it. This has to be complete for you to get a done stamp for this assignment at the end of the class. And if you'll notice, it only goes up to about page to number 48, and there were 53 slides. So this is going to carry over to the back of that next page. So pause the video now, take a few minutes, set up this chart. All right, let's take a look at number one. Number one is a valley. Keep in mind that what a valley is. A valley is a depression, a low point that runs in one direction. It's not just a hole in the ground, it's going somewhere. Typically these are caused by either glaciers or what you see in this case, in a couple of these pictures here, are rivers. Rivers move that stuff, and as rivers go somewhere, they carve out a valley. Now that's opposed to what we call a basin. A basin is a low area, basically just like a hole in the ground. So it's a low point, but it doesn't go anywhere. Think of it as being kind of like a bowl. Most basins fill with water, and they become lakes or swamps or something like that. This happens to be Death Valley, which is a place where we know it doesn't rain very often. So that's a good example of a basin that hasn't filled with water. And I'm going to show you a short video of another example of a basin. So here I am in New Mexico, and I'm going to pan all the way around 360 degrees. You can see there's mountains all around me. And where I'm standing, the ground's kind of flat. So I'm certainly at a lower elevation than all of these mountains around me. Now a valley would have a low point that seems to run between the mountains. But in this case, as you notice as I go all the way around to the other side, there isn't any place where there isn't high ground around me. So basically I'm sitting at a low point here with mountains all around me. This is a good example of what a basin looks like as opposed to a valley. Number two is obviously a cave. It's a natural hollow space under the ground. You look at this picture, you know this is underground, it's a cave. This is a special type of cave. It is called a solutional cave. And a solutional cave is one where water was the thing that made the opening under the ground, which is true of most of the caves that you see and most of the caves that we're going to study. On your notes, you might want to make a note that you can also have caves made from lava or from mountain building, but for the most part, most of our caves we're going to look at are solutional caves where water moves stuff under the ground. Number four, these are hills or mountains, and remember that hills and mountains are the same thing. They're an elevated piece of land higher than its surroundings, and whether it's a tiny hill or a huge mountain, they have the same definition. It's an elevated piece of land higher than its surrounding. Hills and mountains. Number five, this is a sinkhole. This is where the ground underneath the surface was eroded and it went away and it basically caved in on itself. You can kind of think of it as being like a cave where it collapses and then you wind up with a big hole down into the ground. And we'll look at the properties of sinkholes a little bit later on this week. Number six, we've got these little hills in front of bigger hills or in front of bigger mountains. These are called foothills. Number seven. Now, number seven seems to be a cut in the ground that goes a certain direction. You can see where I'm standing in the picture on the right that it has a definite direction that it's going, so it looks kind of like a valley definition. But if you notice my sun there on the left has very, very steep sides. And a valley that has steep sides is typically called a canyon. But when the canyon is really, really narrow compared to its height, it is called a slot canyon. And that's what you see here. These are examples of slot canyons, where you have a valley with steep sides, a canyon, but it's extremely, extremely narrow compared to its height, and it will call a slot canyon. It looks like me in the picture on the right. It looks like I'm standing in the slot of the slot canyon. Here's some other examples of what slot canyons look like. Very, very narrow with very, very high sides. Number 8 is a hoodoo. A hoodoo, something we looked at before, we just didn't give it a name. This is the result of differential weathering, where the different types of rocks weather at different rates, and you get these totem pole shapes. You can see how the rock isn't weathering evenly. Typically, these are called totem pole rocks, or more appropriately, hoodoos. Number 9, the highest point of an elevation, highest point of a hill or mountain, is called its crest, or its summit. Number 10, we've got some isolated, kind of flat-topped hills sitting out there. These are all hills or mountains. They're kind of by themselves, nothing else around them, and they have generally flat tops. Now we have a couple of things that have that definition. This one is actually a butte, B-U-T-T-E. And in your notes, make note that a butte is taller than it is wide. That's what defines this as a butte. Now, number 11, we've got the top of some mountains here. But as opposed to mountains that come to a point, these are mountains that seem to have a continuous elevated high point. This is called a ridge. This is when a mountain doesn't have one single point that it comes to. It's like a line that has basically a bunch of high points running together. This is called a ridge. Number 12, obviously a waterfall. You might want to note that waterfalls, once again, are a product of differential weathering. You have to have two rocks that are weathering differently. You have soft rock underneath harder rock. That's the only way you get a waterfall really forming. Now these next two slides are going to go together because it's hard to show you this. What we've got here is a really big area. And we see this long extended cliff. Well, that really big area is really flat, and then all of a sudden it drops down to a cliff. You kind of see the same thing here. We've got a big chunk of land, and you can see how the top is flat. But you can also see that it has at least one or two really steep sides that make cliffs. This is the definition of what a plateau is. A plateau is a very large area of land that is flat on top, but has at least one very steep side, typically cliffs. So in your notes, you might want to make a mention of that plateaus are really, really big with flat tops. Now here we have another isolated mountain with kind of a flat top to it. This is not a plateau. It's a little bit smaller now, but it's not a butte either. This is called a mesa. A mesa is a isolated flat top hill, kind of sitting out there by itself, has a flat top to its steep sides. What distinguishes a mesa, make a note of this, is that mesas are wider than they are high. And you can see that these three shapes, they look kind of like rectangles on their sides because they are wider than they are tall. These here are stalactites. These are deposits of minerals on the roof of a cave. They are being held tight to the ceiling, stalactite. And these are formed when water drips through a cave, and every time it drips through, it leaves some of its minerals behind, and you get big piles of minerals hanging from the ceiling of a cave. Number 16, these are called spires or pinnacles. This is basically a butte that continues to weather, and it gets smaller and smaller and skinnier until basically it has a pointy shape to it. This is a spire, or also called a pinnacle. Now, the difference between a butte, mesa, spire. Basically, you're going to start off as a plateau, and when it rains, the rain washes off the plateau. Now, the top doesn't erode because it's flat. But as soon as the water falls over the side and goes down those cliffs, erosion happens very, very quickly. So the cliffs end up eroding backwards, and a plateau will turn into a mesa. And it keeps raining. Once again, the top doesn't erode because it's flat, but the sides will. So the sides get closer and closer together. They erode more, so a mesa will turn into a butte. If this keeps on eroding, because it's going to keep on raining, the sides are going to keep getting closer and closer together till you wind up with something like this. So a plateau erodes to a mesa, which erodes to a butte, which erodes to a spire. Here we have a natural arch. This is a natural arch shape that was caused when something moved the rock there in the middle. In all of these cases, it was probably done by wind, because we don't see a place where there was flowing water, or there doesn't appear to be a stream bed underneath. Number 18 is a cliff. It's any vertical or nearly vertical face of rock. Number 19 was a little bit tricky, and this is something we'll explore a little bit later in the week. This is called land subsidence. This is a case where land has gone down, not because we had a landslide or a sinkhole. This is a large area of land that seems to be dropping over time. And this happens when people take water out of the ground via wells. When you take water out of the ground, the water takes up space. So as you take out that water, the land's going to shrink down and compress. So overall, the elevation of these areas go down. You typically find these in places where you have a lot of wells taking a lot of water out of the ground. Southern California, especially, where they're watering crops. You can see the bottom two pictures. Those are wells and motors that were poured with concrete bases. And now the concrete bases don't even rest on the ground anymore because the ground has sunk down so much. Number 20 is a barrier island. And it's an island. It's out there in the ocean. Barrier islands are long, skinny, sandy, and they run parallel to the coast, and you can see that in all these pictures. That's the thing you want to look for to identify barrier island. They're sandy, long, skinny, and parallel to the coast. 21 is an exfoliation dome, and what they all have in common is you see that dome shape to them. The one in the lower left, that's Stone Mountain. 22 is a canyon. A canyon is a valley that has very steep or has cliffs for the sides. The difference between the canyon and the valley is how steep the sides are. A valley is going to have gradual sides to it, whereas canyons have steep sides, like cliffs. 23 is plains, any wide open flat area without much change in elevation. 24, this is another cave formation. This is a pile of minerals, but this is when there was a lot more water than one drip at a time. Water was flowing, and hence the term flowstone. 25. This is the pattern we see in these rivers when they make big wide turns. These are called meanders. To meander means you're kind of going kind of slow. You're taking your time. And that's what these rivers are doing. They're moving really slow, and they're just kind of meandering through the landscape. 26 is a delta. This is where a river meets the ocean and starts dropping all of its sediments, and they pile up. Well, then the river kind of has to go around, and it usually goes around one side and then the same on the other, so you wind up with these triangle-shaped river deltas. Number 27, there's a hint here that this was a glacial landform. These little teardrop-shaped hills are called drumlins. 28, this is a stalagmite because it is a pile of minerals that might eventually reach the ceiling if the pile gets big enough. 29, these are sea stacks. These are isolated chunks of rock or material hanging out there in the ocean that are now separate from the mainland due to extended amounts of erosion. 30 is a spit. A spit is a small little piece of pointed sand sticking out into the ocean. Think of it as a small sandy cape, because a cape has a pointed end to it. These here, we got 3 separate glaciers, and they're just digging away at that mountain. And the little bit of rock that's in between them is a type of a ridge. It's called an Arete, Arete. It's a French word because it was first named by the French in the French Alps. These glaciers eat away the rock and they leave behind those little ridges in between. 32, we got a pile of sand sticking out in the middle of the river. This is called a bar. A bar is any pile of sediments that is higher than the water level in a river. Typically, we would say a sandbar, but they can be gravel bars, they can be silt bars. Usually, they're a mix of material. So instead of saying just sandbar, we're going to call them a bar. 33, sometimes water doesn't drop its sediments in a river, it drops it on the ground. Well, when there's no more water to take it away, the sediments just kind of fan out, and they make this fan shape. Hence the term alluvial fan. We wouldn't see these in Georgia where we have a lot of rivers taking our sediments places, but these are very typical in the desert west, that water runs down the hill when it does rain, takes the sediments to the bottom, and then the sediments just fan out because there's no river for that water to run into and remove the rest of the sediments. 34. 34 is a pile of sediments that winds up right beside rivers after they flood. These piles of sediments are called levees, and they are natural. Every time a river floods and the river comes out of its bank, it starts to drop its sediments immediately. So you wind up with piles of sediments right beside a river called a levee. 35 is a peninsula. A peninsula is any point of land that kind of sticks out into the water and generally has water on three sides. Florida, the Korean Peninsula, all very good examples. Now, a special type of peninsula, one that comes to a point on the end, is called a cape. 37, here we have a natural bridge. We have a situation where water has cut through materials, cut through rock, and now the rock is bridging the river or the stream that eroded. So we have a natural bridge. The difference between a natural bridge and an arch is the fact that in a natural bridge, we have water that can be seen. The water was the thing that moved the sediments and caused the erosion. 38 is a column. This is when you have a stalagmite and a stalactite eventually grow and they meet in the middle and they become one continuous shape. 39, we've got a narrow piece of land that connects two bigger pieces of land. That is called an isthmus. The country of Panama is a very famous one that it connects the large chunk of land of North Central America to South America. Number 40 is a cove. A cove is a circular inlet from the ocean. So we're talking salt water here. It's a smaller circular inlet from the ocean, typically with a narrow opening. 41, we've got a small stretch of water that connects two larger bodies of water, kind of cuts through land. This is called a strait. S-T-R-A-I-T, strait. Now, number 42, I had to give you a hint here. This is a glacier that caused these pictures, and all these bodies of water are connected to the ocean. These are huge digs in the land caused by a glacier, very typically found in northern locations, especially in the country of Norway. The term for this landform is called a fjord, F-J-O-R-D. It's a Norwegian word because that's where you saw this type of landform. It's an extremely deep, long cut in the land that reaches the ocean. These here are all examples of bays. There's a small inlet from the ocean surrounded by land, generally on three sides. A gulf, on the other hand, tends to be larger than a bay. It is a inlet from the ocean, typically surrounded by land with a smaller opening for its size. Obviously, the Gulf of Mexico is a very good example when we talk about gulfs. Now, gulf versus bay, it's kind of like hills and mountains. They're almost the same thing. You can have a bay that looks a lot like a gulf, and you might have a gulf that looks like a bay. So scientifically, there isn't a huge distinction, but most people associate gulfs with being larger than bays. 45, a group of islands is called an archipelago, is any group of islands together. Notice these are not barrier islands. They're not long, skinny, sandy, and they're not parallel to the coast. This is any group or chain of islands. 46. This is a sea cave. This is where the ocean waves have carved out the rock and made caves. 47. This takes a little bit of explanation. This is what we call a headland. This is where we get a very high, typically sided by cliffs, a very high cliff-sided piece of land that sticks out into the ocean. So think about it as like a peninsula with cliffs all the way around it. That's something you might want to note to help you remember what a headland is. Number 48, we've got part of the stream that seems to be taking away a lot of land on one side. That is called the cut bank, where the stream is cutting or removing material faster than it does on the other side, because the water's faster on that side and more water hits that side. Generally, you see these where streams curve and causes more water to hit one side than the other, so it causes more erosion. You get a cut in the land, hence cut bank. 49, this is a sea arch. When you have that headland that's sticking out into the water and it has high cliffs, well, the waves hit the bottom of the cliff, and eventually they can erode all the way through the cliff, and you have a shape like this, a sea arch. Sometimes they last, sometimes they don't. The one in the bottom right-hand corner, that's a very famous symbol for the country of Malta, and it collapsed, I think, 2 years ago. And this was like a national thing, like a national symbol, and the waves eventually ate away too much at it, and it fell down. Number 50, this is called a cirque, C-I-R-Q-U-E. It's from the French word for circle. What happens is the glacier that is high up in the mountains, the weight of the glacier, the movement of the glacier, it cuts into the side of the mountain, and it tends to make this circular shape, hence the name cirque. It is a huge circular depression caused in the side of a mountain. 51 is a point bar. Now we've got a deposit of sediments in the stream. Think of it as like a sandbar, but it's not in the middle anymore. It's on the inside curve of a stream. And it gets the name point bar because it kind of comes to a point. Even though it looks kind of rounded, it's still called a point bar. Now, cut banks and point bars always go together, because if the water is going faster and hitting the other side of the stream where it's cutting the bank, that means on the other side there isn't as much water coming along. The water's going to go slower with less force, and it's going to drop sediments. So cut banks and point bars are typically always seen across streams from one another. 52 is called an oxbow lake. And this is where we have those big wide turns, those meanders in a river, and something happened where they got cut off. They got isolated. Well, there's not water flowing through them anymore. Now they're a stagnant body of water. They are a lake, typically right beside these rivers, and they're called an oxbow lake, because that's what the oxbow looked like when you put on the ox to plow the field. It has that kind of circular shape to it. It's what you would hit your plow to. Finally, 53, we got this glacier bulldozing downhill, and it makes a big pile of stuff, sometimes on the side and sometimes at the end. In this case, we're looking at the one at the end. This is called a moraine. A moraine is the stuff at the end of the glacier. A terminal moraine is the more correct term, because you can have a lateral moraine. You have stuff on the sides, but the stuff at the end is called the terminal moraine. After you have completed this assignment, show it to Miss Daly and I to get your done stamp, and be ready for the next set of instructions as to what you're going to do with this presentation.